The other thing I think is really important for people to understand is like it's a world filled with rejection, and you can't let that define like who you are as an artist and a creative, because even the people that you think are like your like heroes and like writers, like those people are still constantly getting rejections.
Kristen Arnett is the author of the novel With Teeth, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Fiction and the New York Times bestselling novel Mostly Dead Things. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Time, The Cut, Oprah Magazine, and elsewhere. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to discuss her latest book, Stop Me If You've Heard This One. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Kristen.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Excited to have you here, Kristen, and tell me, where does your story as an author begin?
I think like many people who are creatives, it starts like when you're younger and just doing something for fun, because you start doing a thing and you realize that you love it so much you never not want to do it. Like you want to just be doing it all the time. So I was writing stories and reading like voraciously as a child. I grew up in a very Southern Baptist evangelical household where what I was allowed to read was very restricted. So I did everything in my power to find books and like escape, and writing was a way that I was able to do that. So and then from there I just was writing all the time and submitting places. I don't have an MFA, I have a master's in library science. um, but as I was like getting my degree, I was applying to workshops and different things, and I always tell people like these things like the things that are meant for you come to you, because the things that I decided to do ended up like touching each other. So a workshop I got into is where I found my agent, and through that same workshop and that agent, I found my first publisher, and now I'm like a full-time writer. So it's like these things just happen the way that they're supposed to, I feel.
Yeah, living the dream.
Yeah.
Did you ever find yourself writing the things that you weren't allowed to read growing up?
Yes. I mean, I'm also like a queer writer, and I definitely was not out as a child or even as a young adult. That was not something that would have been acceptable in my household growing up. So I was all the time trying to write these stories, even before I knew that I was gay, about like characters where I'm like, there's something different about them. There's something different about this person. And I'm like, oh, it's like trying to figure out, like, ask yourself questions. It's just the most fun way to write, I think, and the most rewarding. And like when you really get like a good story going is like when you're asking questions. So I was like doing a lot of writing about like families, which I still write a lot about families, but also people who don't understand each other inside of families, and like what it's like to be like a gay person. And also in Florida, because I'm exclusively a Florida writer. I would call myself a place writer, and I write a lot about Florida.
Like one of my favorite authors is Carl Hyacin, and he writes exclusively about Florida and the weirdos. That I can say that because I'm a native Floridian. So I was born in Plantation, so I know the Florida man thing is real, um, from my point of view anyway. Take me on the journey of that first book. When you said you met your agent and your publisher at that first workshop. I'm curious on just the journey for that first book, kind of going from idea to bookshelf.
Yeah, for sure. I know every book and every author has their own story. For me, since this is my third novel that'll be coming out this year, each book has had its own trajectory and its own process. That book specifically, it was the first time I'd ever tried to write a novel. I considered myself kind of exclusively to be a short fiction writer. I love short fiction. I'm a huge fan of reading short fiction. We have a lot of great Florida authors who do short fiction, Lauren Groff, Cameron Russell. Like, we have great short fiction here in the state of Florida. But I had never tried to write a novel, not because I didn't want to, but because I just didn't feel like I had a story like that. I don't know. And so I went to Kenyon Writers Workshop. And while I was there, I started writing like what I thought was a short story about a brother and a sister who are taxidermying like a family friend's beloved pet goat, and they like screw it up royally. It's like completely destroyed, and they're having this fight with each other. And as I was writing this short story, I got really invested in these characters, and not just like where they were in time inside this story, but like who they were outside of this like moment in time. Like, who's their family, like who's the family friend, like what does their town look like. And I was like, oh, this is like much broader than a short story. So I started writing what became Mostly Dead Things, my first novel. And as I got it over to like workshop at Tin House the following year, I met my now agent through like a kind of thing. It almost feels like speed dating. You sit down for like 5 minutes and you see if you like are a good match. And I was talking to her about this project, and she's like, well, this project sounds crazy, I'm very interested in it. I was like, it's that classic story, like a lesbian taxidermist takes over her family's taxidermy business in Central Florida after her father commits suicide. That story everyone knows.
I mean, it's so common. It's so
Yeah.
common. We all know somebody who's done that.
It's like it's a thing that everybody's had touch their lives. So I and while I was there at Tin House, like I ended up like talking with my agent, and then talking with the people I was there like at the workshop with. And Tin House Books is also a publisher, and my agent, who I acquired after that workshop, was like, maybe we should send it back to Tin House. And we sent it to them. And I'm like, I don't know if they're going to want to do this. And they immediately were like, we would love to publish this book. So it ended up being like something where I'm like, everything, all the stars aligned for that book. And then it did so well, like much better than I anticipated, this like strange story about weird Florida families and taxidermy and grief to go. Like it touched a lot of people, which I think says something about like the nature of memory and grief and nostalgia being like taxidermy as a metaphor.
Yeah. What did you take from writing that first book, so that first experience, into your next couple of projects? Like, what did you learn from that experience that you were able to tap into for your later work?
Well, I learned that, and I think I keep having to learn this lesson, which is that each book, as I said previously, like requires its own kind of system. Not only to like think up and like dream up, but also to write. I'm not an outliner. I'm not a person who's ever been able to outline anything that I've ever done in my life. Some of that is like, if I get bored, I will stop working on something. And so if I feel like if I know what's going to happen inside of a story, that's very boring to me. And I feel like if I'm bored, then the reader is going to be incredibly bored, because I'm the one who has the most investment in whatever I'm making. So this first book I wrote, Mostly Dead Things, because I'd never written a novel, I didn't know that I could. And so I gave myself rules, and maybe that's like the librarian and me jumping out, where I was like, okay, we'll just like put parameters in place and we'll see like what happens. So I gave myself, for the first novel, it was like I had to write Monday through Friday, 1,000 words a day at least. I could do more. I couldn't do less. I didn't have to write on the weekends, but if I wanted to, I could. And then the other rule I gave myself was that I could not edit as I went along, because I was worried that I would see what I'd written and be like, this is garbage, and throw it away. And I was like, I want to give myself an opportunity to like create this book. So I did that. And I was like, at the end of like however many months, I'll have something that's book length. And that's what I did for that project. And it was a mess afterwards. And I had to edit for like a year plus, like hard edits. So for my next book, because this first book did so well, it went to auction and was like in a bidding war between like 11 different publishers. And that was not like something I had ever thought would ever happen or had experienced. And so I had a short fiction collection, which was completed, and 20,000 words of the next novel. And the publisher I ended up going with, which is Riverhead Books, they bought the book on, like promise of completion. And that was my second novel with teeth. So then it was like it was already bought by a publisher, but not finished. And so I had to sit down and write it. And that was a completely different process, because I was like, somebody's already purchased this book and it's like up to me to work on it. And so I was writing like 2,000 plus words a day and just like zooming through that. And it was a different experience knowing that somebody was expecting it versus like I was writing that first book, I'm like, nobody could ever see this, I'm like on my own. And then this last book, I kind of thought about it for a whole year before I even wrote a single thing. I was like, I really want to think about it. It's a book about a birthday clown. So I was like, I'm thinking about clowns for a whole year. And then I sat down one day when I was ready to work on it, and I pounded a draft out in 3 months, and I sent it to my agent, and she was like, this is the cleanest book you've ever sent me. And when we sent it to our publisher, like to Riverhead, the book that I sent in to my agent is essentially the book that is coming out. It was very clean and like pretty much ready to go. So I think it like cooked enough in my brain, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a lesson there. Let things ruminate for a little while, and then, but 3 months, that seems fast, even for someone as accomplished as yourself. To me, that would freak me out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, some of it too is like now that I write full time. Like when I wrote my first novel, I've been like working full time in libraries since I was like 20 years old. I had like a very non traditional kind of school thing where I was like working and I went to school at night to get my degrees. And I wrote mostly dead things. Like I think about it now and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I wrote that whole book because I actually had a son when I was a teenager. So I had like a child. He's 24 now, but I had like a kid at home. I was working full time. I was trying to write this book. I was going to school. Like I was doing all this different stuff, plus getting myself into workshops and doing different things. And I wrote a book. And so now I'm like, oh, wow, like the luxury of just being able to having like the publishing contract I've had has meant that I just get to be home and work. And you know, my son's 24, so he's an adult and he's out on his own. So it's like literally just me home, like working. But I think like the thing with this book was that it was really ready for me to write it. I had such a pleasure sitting down working on it. Every day I wanted to like open the Word document and be like, it's time to get into this book. And I do think that had a lot to do with it going really fast because I was like, I can't wait to work on it. I woke up each day being like, I really, really want to see what's going to happen with the story.
Well, I think that's a good segue into talking a little bit more about it. So, what can you share with us about Stop Me If You've Heard This?
Yeah. So you mentioned that the title sounds like a joke, and that's very intentional. So I love that you would pick that up right away. It's a book that's a very voicey first person book about a lesbian birthday party clown in Central Florida who is trying to take her clowning, which she considers her art, to the next level. So she's like very passionate about the art that she makes. And it's the kind of book that is looking at like what it's like to live in a place like Central Florida. I'm third generation Central Florida. So it's like live in a place where people come to visit you quite often in Orlando because we're a tourism and hospitality hub for entertainment, but then leave with an idea that what you do is tacky and that what you do isn't like art, quote unquote. So I was like, okay, what it would be like to be here and specifically be this like icon of things that people don't take seriously, like a clown, and be very serious and be like, I don't care what other people think about it. I'm gonna like make this kind of art and I'm gonna talk about it. So it's the shape of the book I think is like almost like a comedy set. So from like the beginning until the end, and like with bits, like each chapter is kind of like its own bit, but like with a narrative arc set inside of it, where Cherry, my protagonist, is like ruminating on concepts of clowning, like the idea of humor and like what makes something funny, and then also dealing with using humor to deal with like grief because there's also like the loss of her brother inside of this book. So it's like like how to make art inside of capitalism when you like have to work like three different jobs in like a gig economy to like make your art happen and like what that looks like.
Yeah. Did you get to meet or talk to any like children's performers as part of your
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, I mean, some of that, like, it's easier for me maybe because I live in like a hub where it is like a hub of entertainment, specifically children's entertainment. I also grew up like there was like an odd number, and I think back on, I'm like, oh, it didn't seem weird to me at the time, but I was always at church. Like we were at church like 5 days a week, and a lot of these like stay-at-home moms. I was a kid who didn't get homeschooled, but most of my friends were homeschooled, and like their parents, specifically their mothers, like a few of them did clowning on the side. Like we'd have these like festivals at church where it'd be like, it's like so and so's mom, like Mrs. Smith or something, but you couldn't call her Mrs. Smith. You had to call her like Bubbles or Winky or something. And that's what she was the whole day. And like, like, oh, she's not my mom right now. She's in clown. And so like I kind of grew up around some of it in ways that I was like, oh, I didn't think it was weird at the time, but it's like now I'm like, oh, that's a little odd. But and it made me think a lot about personas. So and also I'm a librarian. So I did like a ton of video research. I did a ton of like book research, but like a lot of it, I'm like the idea of like a history of clowning because I wanted Cherry to know like a lot of that information. Even if it doesn't come out on the page, like I wanted to know enough that like I can make her feel like she feels like a know-it-all about that. And then I also was watching all these videos about like, because it's a really physical book. Clowning is a very physical comedic art, like right, like the pratfall, like slipping on a banana peel, any of these like squirting somebody with like a flower from a lapel, or like producing a scarf or like balloon animals. Like these are all like very physical, active things. And so I was like, I need to see how they function in like three-dimensional real life so I can write them that way in scene. So I was watching all these videos about like the art of the pratfall, and it'd be like somebody talking very seriously up front about like, here's like the physics of how you need to move your body in order to like perform the joke, and then a clown would come out and like perform it, and it was like so bizarre because I was like, this is like very intense, like the science of it, like the science of the body and how you need to move so you don't hurt yourself and so you can make it the funniest it can possibly be, right? So it was a lot of very strange videos where I'd be like sitting alone in a room watching like YouTube of clowns like just hurting themselves. But it was interesting research. It was very strange research, but it meant that it was never boring for sure.
Yeah. I know a couple of people who are clowns and they take it very seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not like definitely not a joke to them. Like there are schools you got to go to, there are rules you have to follow. There's like a code of like conduct
Yes,
that
there
you
sure
have to
is.
have. And but you're talking about like clowns and falling in a certain way so you don't hurt yourself. And I'm thinking that to me it parallels professional wrestling in that regard. Like I just had that thought. I'm like, I guess they're both like spectacle based, right? And they're there for entertainment, but I know like wrestlers have to learn how to fall and do all these moves so they don't hurt each other. And I'm sure so many of them do, but
Yeah. I mean, wrestling is also, if you think about it, those are also personas, like a lot of the clowns, right? Like they have to be that person. Like even if we're thinking about like old school wrestlers like Hulk Hogan or somebody like
oh yeah.
Macho Man Randy Savage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like Savage with Slim Jim. But these are like people who that's their persona, right? And that's like kind of like the clown if you think about it, right? Like you have like a look and like this is the face and this is who you present as you like perform. But that's like maybe like what clown like researching and clowning has done to my brain. Now everything's clown when I look at it.
Yeah. But also, there's happy clowns and sad clowns, and there's good guys and bad guys in wrestling. It's we
Yeah,
could probably go down a big rabbit hole about the
for sure.
parallels between wrestling and clowns. And it's unfortunate you brought up Macho Man Randy Savage because I could go down a rabbit hole with him too. Man, that guy was. I grew up watching wrestling, and oof,
Uh-huh.
he was a character.
He really was.
Yeah, and I think Hulk is down in your neck of the woods. He was maybe Clearwater Beach, I think. So just a little bit to the west of you.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, I feel like we're a hub for lots of things. It would
yeah,
not surprise me if we had many professional wrestlers down
yeah,
in Florida.
yeah.
Yeah.
So now I'm curious because I always like to throw a few pop culture questions at my guests. But telling me about your background earlier, what were some of your things that you like to read or watch on TV when you were a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I was just so hungry for storytelling and stories. I would read literally anything I could get my hands on because so much of like what I was allowed to read was it had to come from like the Baptist bookstore. So it was like these like the books I was like allowed to read were like, and don't get me wrong, like I still like the Little House books, right? Like Little House on the Prairie, like all the Laura Ingalls. I was allowed to read those. I was allowed to read like Anne of Green Gables, but a lot of like these like very strange like Christian books, like the Mandy book series, which is like just this little blonde girl who's like, I'm 1/16th Cherokee, where it's like also like God helped me solve a crime, like very strange like books where I'm like, wow. But the things I really loved to read was like, and I feel very lucky that I was like allowed to go to public school because that's where I was able to like get books from teachers, like, which I wouldn't have been able to if like a lot of my friends I was homeschooled. So I would borrow books from classrooms and a lot of these teachers would really like turn a blind eye purposely when I would like borrow a book because I would end up keeping the book so I could read it. Like I loved reading like Island of the Blue Dolphin. I read, the True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, which is about this like girl who like is supposed to be going on a ship over to like America, and she ends up like the ship gets overtaken, and she has to learn how to like work on a ship. She's just like this like very young like girl who's like in like a petticoat and stuff. And then like Matilda, like all the Roald Dahl books where it's like kids like figuring out how to like trick their parents or be smarter than their parents. And I was like reading a lot of these books. And then like in middle school, I really got into stuff that was like a lot of horror. Like I started reading Stephen King. I read like all this stuff like Silence of the Lambs. Like I was reading like a lot of things and hiding all those books because I was just like, I really want to read like anything I could get my hands on. Like when they handed out books at the beginning of the year in English classes, those like compilation books that have like all the stories in them and everything, I'd have like the whole book read by like the end of the first week and a half because I was so excited to like be handed a book that just had fiction inside of it that I was allowed to have out in the house. But and then shows like, I don't know, they were really picky about what I could watch too. So I would be like trying to watch things. For some reason they let me watch like the facts of life. uh, so
You take the good, you take the bad.
yeah, and so like I would watch like different stuff like that. I don't know, but then and now I'm obsessed. Like my wife is a TV critic, so we always get to watch TV shows early, and it's like the joy of my life. Like being a writer and getting like early copies of books, and then being with my wife and watching like early episodes of TV. It's like the dream. I'm obsessed with that.
Is there anything that you guys are watching now that you're really into?
Yellow Jackets.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I watched the first two. I haven't gone on to season 3 yet.
It's great. It's really fun. It's been but yeah, so we're like ahead because she gets to watch them for work and then write about them. And so I'm always like, oh, it's so fun. But yeah, Yellow Jackets is so great right now. I mean, that's like a lot of like stuff I'm really into, right? The idea of like feral girls, like cannibalism, that's like fun, weird domestic stuff. Them as adults and how like their childhood impacted them as like messed up adult women. Like so great. That's great stories.
Yeah, no, I love the flash forwards and the flashbacks, I guess. But yeah, that's a great show. But the cannibalism thing is tough. I gotta say, it's a little hard to swallow.
Pun intended. Yeah.
Totally intended. Totally intended. Now, you mentioned Stephen King earlier. He had an interesting relationship with clowns.
Yes.
That's probably the reason why I'm scared of them so much. After
I think a lot of people. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are, rightfully so. I mean, It and Pennywise are like, pop culture icons in this kind of way where it's like, yeah, he's like made the mark. He's also like such a place writer too. Like the way he writes about Maine is like the way I feel like I want to write about Florida. But that particular book and like the way that it like was in the zeitgeist of like cultural imagination in terms of like how people think about clowns.
Yeah.
Is like, yeah, so it was quite a chore. And I say this as a huge Stephen King fan. I've like basically read everything of his. I'm a huge fan. But I was like, it makes it really hard to like sit down and write a book about a clown and be like, I want people to like get into this and be like, this is funny and not be scared. So I was like, there's people who I know have like terrifying phobias of clowns. And so like this book has been like, I had people reach out to me and ask like, well, because I'm about to go on book tour. And they're like, there's not going to be a clown there, right? You didn't like hire a clown. And I'm like, no, I promise. Like there's not going to be like a physical clown at this event because people are afraid. Like people are scared.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is so well known. But it's not his best work. Like I don't love it like the way I like The Stand or even like 11/22/63. I really loved.
Yeah, that's a great book.
But that just got so strange. Like at the end, man, that kind of went off the rails a bit.
That's I also think like classic because he's so great with like openings and like that's like one where it's like it's hard to stick the landing on something that massive. I think my favorite of his. I mean, I have two. I mean, I'm a huge fan of The Shining. I love The Shining. That's great, like domestic narrative. But my real favorite, I think, in terms of craft, and I talk about it all the time, is Pet Sematary. That's like a tight, short book of his where the ending is like a slam dunk. I'm like, the ending on that book is like tight and horrible. And like like when you like read the closing line, which I won't spoil for people, but like, it's great. It's like a great classic. Also, it's like the idea of like, people when they like feel like they want to be like rubbernecking at something like at a tragedy or at a horror, like he has like a whole scene interior in that book where it's like, if you want to be along for this ride, you don't get to look away and you have to stay with me beat by beat while I'm in this cemetery digging up my son. Like that's like oh, you want to rubberneck, then you got to stay with me for pages of this. And I was like, this is a great like craft choice. Like that book to me is just like chef's kiss. I think it's doing some great work.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. He is a master of disaster, if you will. And advice for aspiring writers. What would you say, Kristen, on your book tour, if somebody comes up to you and says, I want to do what you do, Kristen, how do I do it? What kind of advice would you give an aspiring writer?
I would first of all tell them to like if you feel like that's something you want to do, then you can do it. Like for writing, like there's ways to like, I mean, I don't think anybody has control over what publishing will do, right? Like we don't have control over like who's going to buy our work or give us a yes. You can always control you writing it though. Like you and the page, like you sitting down and like making work, that's something you can control. So I think especially like when you're first like starting out and like getting into stuff, it's so important to like trying to work every day or as much as you can, even if it's a pocket of time. Even when I was like at my most busy and I was like working all day and doing stuff for my son and then going to school, like I'd wake up like an hour before and like sit and like I'd be like 6 a.m. and I'd be like kind of bleary eyed and like scrawling little words out. And like, did I keep any of them? I don't know, but it works like a muscle. It's kind of like a habit. I'd also say like the other thing I think is really important for people to understand is like, it's a world filled with rejection, and you can't let that define like who you are as an artist and a creative, because even the people that you think are like your like heroes and like writers, like those people are still constantly getting rejections. Like I get rejections on the daily. Like we just are all like, we're all trying to make work, and like your work is not going to be everybody's cup of tea. How could it be? Right? Like art doesn't work like that. Even like TV shows, like they have certain fan bases, movies, like music, like art, like these things all like have an audience. So like it's possible like when you're getting these rejections, it's just not your reader. So I think like it's important to write every day. It's really important to read, because reading and like kind of like modeling and figuring out like what you want your style to be comes from like reading other people's work. But then also just getting like okay with rejections. It's not like personal to you. It's like just how that works. And it's okay to like get a million no's, and it doesn't mean you're a bad writer.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of no's.
A lot.
It's a no business kind of.
Yes, it really is.
And if you can go back in time and whisper some words of advice into your younger self, so your Kristen, what would you tell the younger Kristen?
Oh gosh, I wish that my younger self would listen to me. I could see my younger self just being like, yeah, right. But I think I would tell myself that like the things that I want to write about and like the things that I'm interested in, it's not weird or something I should be embarrassed about. Because I think I spent a really huge chunk of my teenage years and my early 20s being like, the things that you like are something that you should hide, or like what you're interested in writing isn't something that like people should know about. And I think that that's like a disservice. I did a disservice to myself by like, I mean, we're our own worst critics. Like, so just maybe tell myself not to be so hard on myself. I think that would be good.
Yeah, we are. We are our own worst critics. That is a very true statement. A very true statement. But also, I mean, it seems like you write about things that nobody else is really writing about. I mean, I think that's one of the keys also to breaking through is to write. Someone once told me, write the story that you want to see written but haven't been able to find yet.
Yeah.
And, I think that thing about the taxidermist, lesbian brother sister combo plate, screwing up the goat, or I think it was a goat. I can't remember. That's certainly fit the bill there.
Yeah. I mean, it's also a thing too. I think you have to write something, at least for myself, it's like that you're so passionate about, because it's getting through a book or even a story. Sometimes like it's easy to run out of steam and just be like, I give up, I'm bored, I don't feel like I'm interested. Like the things that have turned into books for me are like when I'm like, wow, I'm like, I can't stop thinking about this. I can't stop researching it. I can't stop talking about it to people. That means it's going to become bigger and livelier and hold a lot of that excitement in it because you're excited. Like if you can't even get that excited up front about an idea, then maybe that's not the project.
Yeah, that's how you know that there's a there, right? If you're excited about it and it's like possessing you.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, this has been a fun conversation, Kristen, and I want to say thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a blast.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.